तुम हमेशा अपना भुजिया इतना जल्दी कैसे खत्म करते हो?
तुम कभी शेयर क्यों नहीं करती हो?
किया तो था दिल्ली में मार्च 2012।
सीरियसली? 2012 मार्च?
अच्छा ले लो, वैसे मानना पड़ेगा आज मैंने तुम्हें अमेरिका में दिल्ली वाली फील दी थी, है ना?
परसों से प्यार जताने का तरीका हल्दीराम्स।
Good afternoon, lovely to have you all back, and we continue with this festival through the afternoon now. We're delighted to welcome to this session the 9th JLF London at the British Library, supported by Haldirams. The session today is New Media, the Slipstream of Information. Mahua Moitra, Member of Parliament, the other Member of Parliament, Shashi Tharoor, and the celebrated journalist, Andrew Whitehead, in conversation with Rita Payne. The evolving role of new media is the subject of much study, scrutiny, and self-examination. At a time when freedom of speech and reach has become as important as freedom of speech, a diverse panel explores the role and responsibilities of the media and the new communications in our time. This conversation will be followed with a Q&A session. Do follow our social media handles, get notifications on upcoming sessions. Please tweet and tag at JLF LitFest. Use the hashtags #JLF London 2022 and JLF London at British Library. Welcome, Mahua, Shashi, Andrew, and Rita.
So welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to see so many people face to face, not just Zooming. I'd forgotten what it was like to be in a big room with a lot of people. It's my privilege. Okay. Closer? Yeah. Better? Yeah, so it's my privilege and delight to actually have such amazing speakers. I mean, each speaker could keep you enthralled, I think, for the rest of the day. And as for Shashi, I was thinking, I think you could probably wake him up in the middle of the night, say, Shashi, talk for an hour on any topic, and he won't hesitate. So it should be exciting, and you know what the scope of the discussion is. Just for the record, to let you know what my interest is, because I'm with the Commonwealth Journalists Association, and we are an organization, we're sort of committed to protecting or defending media freedom, highlighting abuses. So that's where I'm coming from. And I'm sure that Mahua will be telling us the point of view from politicians, and Shashi straddles both, a journalist, writer, and a politician. And of course, Andrew, we're ex-colleagues, and we can talk about the days when we first joined the newsroom, when we had to get two sources to report on any story, and there was a strict divide between opinion and news. And to this day, I sit on the fence. I do find expressing an opinion very difficult, because I listen to one and listen to another, and I think, no opinion. And then I think, no, it's all changed. So I was just reading Alan Rusbridger's book on news and how to use it. And he had some very, very interesting comments about what's happening at the moment. He said people everywhere feel ever more alienated from and mistrustful of news and those who make it. We no longer seem to know who or what to believe. We are living through a crisis of information chaos. We are at the peak, or so I hope he says, of the most vicious pandemic to have gripped the world in a century or more. The question of what information you can trust is all of a sudden a matter of life and death. And he says, and he blames a lot on social media, online media. And then, of course, when we started as journalists, the big emphasis was on impartiality, fairness, balance. That's what all journalists aspire to. And I'd like to hear from the other panelists on really how impartial can you really be, no matter how you try. So he says there is more disinformation put out in the world than ever before. And much of it is politically motivated. And of course, then one has to look at the ownership of the media, which is something, money and media, and how that's locked in. And then, of course, there are so many topics. There's regulation, and what do you do about it? So this is just the general comments. So can I start with you, Shashi? And just to clarify, I will ask each panelist to speak for about 5-10 minutes informally, give their take on the topic, and then we can open up the discussion, and then 15 minutes before, we'll be taking questions from you. So Shashi, new media, you are everywhere. You've got, how many million followers on Twitter?
8.3, I think, something like that.
There you go, 8.3. Before digital media, how many would you have expected to reach when you spoke?
Well, I mean, it actually, it was an impossible thing to estimate. I mean, you could address an audience and count the heads in the room. There are, perhaps 200 here right now. But in a newspaper, the newspaper circulation is always exaggerated. And in any case, there's no guarantee that the story reporting your comment will be read by everybody who buys that newspaper. So you had really no accurate way of gauging how many you were reaching. And social media did give you that. Social media also allowed you to bypass the gatekeepers, allowed you to go beyond the media that was actually filtering or deciding what they thought was interesting and valuable. And I was an early adopter of Twitter simply because it gave me an opportunity, first of all, to kind of demystify the processes of governance. I was when I became minister in the government of India, our computers were disabled from accessing social media. You couldn't go on twitter.com, you couldn't go on Facebook or whatever, on a government computer. And so I used to tweet on my personal cell phone because I thought it was important. Initially, when I started this business, I earned the rather bitter enmity of the media, which at that point saw social media as a threat, a means by which officialdom would bypass them. That didn't do me a lot of good because I got sort of fairly viciously attacked for it in the mainstream media. But equally, I worried people in government and politics who thought that government was meant to be a little mystifying and opaque. They weren't very happy that people should talk about these things. Now, I was able to justify it on 2 or 3 grounds. The first was that stories that our national media either didn't have the interest or the resources to cover, the only way you could get out news about them was by actually tweeting. So when I went to Liberia, a country that no Indian minister had visited ever, other than one sort of airport flyover stop for 2 hours 50 years previously, there was obviously no journalist accompanying me who would go to Liberia. It was my tweets that gave anyone any news of what India was trying to do in Liberia. Or when I became one of the first ministers to go to Haiti at the end of the when the earthquake happened in 2010, there wasn't any Indian media there covering the earthquake and its aftermath. And sort of my tweets and photographs were really the first news on which even Indian media found themselves basing their stories. So there was an obvious advantage of communicating information that would otherwise not be communicated to the public. That was number one. Number two, by then already we'd had examples of social media even being life-saving. We'd actually had stories of, for example, this people finder that Google came up with that actually helped people to trace those displaced in natural disasters, whether it was Fukushima in Japan, whether it was the Haitian earthquake and so on. It actually saved lives. It connected people together. And of course, around the same time, you had the various color revolutions, the Jasmine Revolution and so on, the Arab Spring. And there again, social media was justified as having given people who were otherwise voiceless a voice, given people who otherwise had no means of organizing themselves, especially in repressive societies where there was no freedom of assembly for them. Social media allowed them to issue a call saying, come to Tahrir Square, and everyone showed up. You know, that sort of thing. So that was a third justification. So there were all of these good reasons why social media was worth getting onto. And for me too, I rather enjoyed, especially those initial, I would almost say months, but let's say the initial year or so, the genuine exchange and sometimes banter with genuine people. I mean, with the real members of the voting public who are asking you questions and getting answers and expressing opinions that you could push back upon or concur with. And all of that made social media a refreshingly different way of interacting with the public. Subsequently, however, it became a much less agreeable experience for most of us. First of all, other political parties decided that this was a tool they could use in a much more organized fashion. So you had entire cells being created to disseminate a party line, which is fine, but also to attack and troll and distort the other side, which is less fine. And there's literally one chap sitting having created 100 fake accounts under 100 anonymous names, and then sending out more or less the same message, often in identical language, to attack the same person. And because people were not prepared entirely for all of that, a lot of people assumed these were genuine people's genuine opinions and that the minister must be as awful as the tweet said he was, and so on. That became, there was a lot of toxicity coming into the social media. Then became, you know, especially with anonymous handles, a lot of vilification, abuse, the lies and distortions then followed. And suddenly it became a much less hospitable place. Some of the early users of Twitter actually abandoned it. I felt that politically it would be foolish to do so, so I stayed on. But I stopped reading and reacting to a lot of the tweets because every time I did, I would have 10 well-meaning people tell me, why did you react to that? Don't you know that person is a troll or that person is a known agent of this particular party or whatever? And so at the end of the day, you think, you know, aside from a few random, I mean, literally 5 minutes a day, I would look at half a dozen messages addressed to me, tagging me. And if I found any of them interesting, I might respond. But otherwise, it's become a much more of a one-way communication than is ideal. And that's true for some altogether. I mean, people like the Prime Minister's account and so on, he never replies to anybody. He just uses it to, in a sense, as an alternative form of broadcasting his Man Ki Baat, you know, that sort of message. And I think that this is, sadly, a limitation now. The original concept of social media, I think, was rather good. But all of these negatives have impeded, I think, the usefulness and effectiveness of them, of the medium.
Well, that's helpful because Mahua, I first became aware of you and the impact you were having when your clip went viral, your maiden speech. Mm. And I found all of a sudden I was getting emails and clips, everything with your video from every quarter. Have you heard this? Have you heard this? Have you seen this? Yeah. Have you heard this? Have you seen this? And so that was really my, as it were, introduction to you. As a politician, I mean, I guess you would agree with Shashi that is it liberating particularly because you can address and engage with voters much more directly?
Yes, I agree with practically all of what Shashi is saying, and that's the problem with speaking after Shashi, is he kind of manages to touch on everything and then you've got nothing left to speak about. But yes, I think one of the things that Shashi spoke about was the advantage he had was getting onto it fairly early enough, which was maybe 2009, 10 or something, but early 9, right? So I had an official Twitter account in 2013, but never used it till I actually became an MP in 2019. Even when I was an MLA, I never used Twitter. Now, when we look at social media, I think in most circles, PLUs, people like us tend to look at social media as one homogeneous. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, blah, blah, blah. But if you are looking at it from my point of view, which is a grassroots politician point of view, I have a rural constituency, as opposed to Shashi, who has a very urban literate constituency. So if you look at my constituency, the only two things that matter are WhatsApp and Facebook. Twitter has almost I think if I have, 25 lakh people in my district, maybe, I don't know, 1,000 people have a Twitter account, maybe 5 people see it. So Twitter or Instagram is not really used in a rural area, whereas whatever people receive on WhatsApp is taken to be gospel truth. And Facebook is used very widely. You'll be surprised at how anyone with a smartphone has Facebook, or even in regional languages, there are these Facebook groups, and Facebook Live is almost becoming an alternative medium of broadcast. So if you've got something to say as a political person, so if I have something to say on, for example, yesterday I wanted to put out a message to my constituency saying, this is what's happened, blah, 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 and I just do a Facebook Live, and by the time I wake up in the morning, there are 50,000 views, or sometimes 1 million views, which is amazing. So as a medium of broadcast and getting your method through, some work better than others, yes, but Twitter as a form of engagement, and sometimes if it's very much become for a politician how you use it. So in Facebook, for example, during the COVID pandemic, I set up these helplines and I said, listen, anyone stuck in Cochin, this is the number to call, or write in here. And people would write in and I would get the details from there. So it was just a platform, like an SOS platform. And that works very well during emergencies. I found Facebook to work very well. Twitter, sometimes you had people during the problems there. But otherwise, as a method of engagement, it is almost, I find it, like Shashi, it has been taken over. The space has been taken over. You don't know who's genuine. You don't even know who's a human being on the other side. So when people say, I get asked this all the time, that how do you react to people trolling you? And Barka's asked me, there's a lot of women journalists have asked me that, we get the foulest, vilest abuse. How do you deal with it? And I say, I don't read it. I just don't read it. So unfortunately, that's not what Twitter was meant to be. It was meant to be a genuine exchange, but it's unfortunately, I just put out my message there and hope that some people will react to it or think about it. But as a method of engagement, it has, because social media has become so institutionalized today, and because of the very vast resources that political parties are pumping into it, it has become the strongest campaign tool. So I said this in one of my speeches, and the last general election was not fought on unemployment. It was not fought on inflation. It was fought on WhatsApp. It was fought on social media. And what is the narrative you can create in social media? And it's this drip, 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 drip. And when you have mainstream media controlling social media, which is what's happening now, so it's just become another arm of mainstream media. And I think then the pressure on other political parties has always been, whoever was in power, is that how does the opposition, any opposition, do you buy a channel? Like people in the southern political parties have their own channels and they do it very successfully. We have never been able to do it very successfully in the East. I think there's an Oriya channel, but that's about it. So getting your own channel involves a huge amount of investment, which people couldn't do. But then with social media, you would think that would go away, but no. Even that now has been taken over by institutionalized media houses. And that space also, for example, WhatsApp, if you have a cell in every booth that is putting out 20 WhatsApps an hour, and we get told by well-meaning people and our voters that, why are you not coming back? Why are you guys just sitting there and getting slapped in the face? What is your pushback? What is your defense? And sometimes I think about it, and my answer always is, A, we don't have the resources to do it. We cannot spend 3,000 crores on keeping a full-time media team, A. But B, more important, do I even want to do it? Do I even want to get into a game that I know is so dirty and so disgusting and it's not even going to get us anywhere, where I'm only sitting from morning to night, not doing anything, but answering these people who are, basically you're just playing defense all the time. And I don't think as a strategy for any political party that can work long term. So I think on the important stuff, it's important to come back. But every single piece of news doesn't need to be countered. And I think that's the trap that large institutionalized social media is putting on all of us. That someone else sets the narrative and we are busy playing catch up. And I think it's time to take a break from that and come out and be like, this is how we're going to play it, and this is how we're going to play it.
It's quite interesting.
Just one small clarification, though my turn to agree with everything Mahua said, except to point out one thing, my constituency isn't actually predominantly urban. It's less than 40% open. The rest is rural.
Sorry.
And for me too, WhatsApp is far more important. So what I do is I only tweet myself, but my staff then takes my tweets and replicates them on Facebook because that's where the
That's what
audience
they
is. I probably have fewer than 5% also of my voters. But you know, Twitter puts you on the national agenda.
Yeah.
And so if you want to appeal to an audience beyond your constituency, that's still useful.
You know, which is why I still.
Which is why you do it, and which is why I do it.
But as a journalist, I mean, it's quite interesting. In a way, you're almost independent of traditional media. You feel that as a politician, you can appeal directly to people. You don't really need to be filtered through the media as in the old days. You need to be interviewed. Does it matter to you whether you make headlines or not in the national newspapers, or do you find you've got your own channel now, you're in control?
No, I don't. Frankly, that hasn't bothered me. That's never bothered me. Even with my first speech, I got asked this a lot of times, did you know this would happen? No, I just spoke my mind and it came out in a way, and I'm happy to know that so many people resonate with it. That makes me very happy. So it's not being in the... But if I say something that I think is important and the media picks it up, and half the time they don't show the other point of view, but sometimes if it's strong enough, they do. And I'm happy about it, but it's not something I hanker about. I don't have a PR agency or a PR strategy or a media person, and I don't even engage with the media. And, I've heard chatter in Central Hall where a few of even our well-meaning friends, our common well-meaning friends, come around saying, she's got the media in her grip and, around her little finger, and whatever she says goes viral. But I'm lucky it happens, but that's probably because I speak my mind, not because I've got people on my payroll. So I think for me, the strategy has always been to be true to yourself, as I think Shashi is too. And sometimes it gets us in trouble, but hey, that's part of the territory.
Well, there's a lot to follow up in that case, because the World Press Freedom Index for 2022 highlights the disastrous effects of news and information chaos, as it's described, the effects of a globalized and unregulated online information space that encourages fake news and propaganda. And this index assesses the state of journalism in 180 countries and territories. And it paints a disturbing picture, proving that journalism remains a dangerous profession. In 2021 alone, 293 journalists were imprisoned across the world. 28 were killed. Of those 28 cases, 22 remain unsolved. So, Andrew, I'll just come to you on this, in that at the time when we were at the BBC, there wasn't all that much choice for people to go to. And the BBC had this huge reputation, and we felt we could sit there and we're very impartial when we were balanced, etc. But now the whole situation has changed. What do you think, with your background at the BBC and what's happening now and you're training young journalists, what's your take?
Well, Alan Rusbridge had talked about the crisis of confidence in traditional mainstream news providers. And I think that's right, but there is a crisis of confidence in all established power centres, in politics, in political parties, in religion. This has been amplified by the digital landscape, amplified by social media, but it has not been caused or created by that. And on the whole, I'm still glass half full. I mean, I can see the great problems of disinformation, of trolling, of misogyny, which we see on social media. But the digital landscape and all that it provides is profoundly democratic and empowering. WhatsApp has transformed every aspect of India. From my extended family, my wife's Indian, we've got lots of relatives across India. WhatsApp is the main means of keeping in touch for all sorts of groups, political groups, social groups, family groups. It provides market information in a way that could never have been provided in previous eras. And all of that is really wonderful. It also means, I teach journalism at the Asian College of Journalism in Chennai, and I teach American journalism students here in London. And I explained to them that when I was a student, if I wanted to get my message out, or my little group wanted to get my message out, we would have to buy what was called a duplicator skin and type it out and duplicate and hand it out at street corners. It was laborious. It did mean you thought quite a lot about what you expressed, and there's a plus in that, But it was a really different environment from today when you can get your stuff out on social media without any real barriers. Now, the absence of barriers can be a problem, and how do you get your material noticed is also a problem, but it's an opportunity. What we've also seen is the way in which large monopolies have corrupted the digital landscape. They're much too powerful, they're much too political, and they are much too resistant to effective regulation, and regulation clearly is required because of all that we can see. But the digital revolution has not just disrupted the business model for old school journalism, it has swept it aside, it has devastated it. So when I say to students, journalism students, I get slightly worked up about this, tell me about some journalism that you've seen, tell me about it. And they'll refer to a newspaper article or a video that they've seen, and I'll say, it's really interesting, where did you find it? And they'll say, oh, Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. And I'll say, no, whose journalism is it? Who created that? And broadly, they don't know. And that's sort of, I find that very unsettling. And I teach people who want to be TV journalists who do not consume linear TV broadcasts, which I find slightly befuddling. On the other hand, I mean, COVID has been a moment when the old established news providers have regained a certain level of reach and authority, because it was one of those stories, the opposite to Brexit, and I won't go into Brexit, I don't think you want me to go into Brexit, where people really wanted to turn to news providers who will tell it straight and tell it as it is. And they turned back to the old established news providers. That's just one element of this. And one of the problems is the traditional news providers have not been very good in getting the zeitgeist of digital. Yes, they've all got websites and social media accounts, but they don't quite necessarily get the informality of tone that goes with it. And I think that's a real problem. But there are opportunities there as well as problems. And as I say, on the whole, I'm still positive, because I think without the digital landscape, we would all be so much poorer.
What interests me is that what I'm noticing more and more, that the media is avoiding certain topics when it might be dangerous. It's almost a form of self-censorship, whether it's deliberate or not. Now, for example, we've had it ourselves within our association in that any story about Kashmir seems to cause problems. And I found that our members, our branch in Delhi, said, oh, you can't put that up on your website because we're all being endangered. How can you say that? So there were stories about media suppression in Kashmir, which we couldn't do. Then, of course, as you know here, we had the whole case of transgender issues. Anything that you say is so hypersensitive. And as for Brexit, I mean, there are all these problems, but how often do you see anything directly linked to Brexit in this country? If there are flights cancelled, jobs cancelled, hospitals short of staff, but no one will say, but is there a link anywhere? So I don't know, how do you think this is going to pan out at the moment, in that, do you think you'll find that more and more there won't be public debate about sensitive issues? Shashi, what do you think?
Because I have to say, what Andrew said is fine, except for one omission, which is that whereas the media, the mainstream media, the gatekeepers can be bypassed by social media, at least they used to do fact-checking, which nobody does in social media. So WhatsApp University has become a sort of shorthand for misinformation. And there's an enormous amount of lies and distorted narratives very deliberately put out in these various groups that Mamta was talking about. Political parties literally run. You can send broadcast messages to 256 people at a time. Each person runs 1,000 such groups. They're all sliced and diced. If you've got enough money, that is, and some parties, or one party has the money, the rest of us are the receiving end of it. But anyway, they just send these things out. And, Goebbels' famous line about how the lie can go around the world before the truth has put its boots on. I mean, that is essentially what has happened. And we've had some, if you want to put politics aside for a minute, there have been at least 2 instances, non-political, would have actually taken lives. There was a famous series of WhatsApp messages in West Bengal warning people about child kidnappers who were coming to villages. And as a result, people who just happened to be driving through a village innocently got lynched, including a government official sent by the government of West Bengal to a village to assure people these were false rumors. He got lynched. So this was the extraordinary kind of danger that sustained messaging can produce. Another example, of course, was a little earlier when there was an incident in which some Islamist group put out a message that actually showed pictures of the Myanmar floods, Cyclone Nargis, and how people had died. And it showed sort of row after bodies wrapped in sheets, and said, these are all Muslims who had been killed in the northeast. Whereupon there was a huge revenge moment in which northeasterners got so many threats that they all got into trains and decamped from Bombay and Bangalore and other cities. And literally 1 million people were on the move because of false WhatsApp messaging. So these are some of the things we don't really talk about. None of this would have actually made it to a mainstream newspaper. But the potency of social media is such that it can actually affect lives. And I think that is an important danger that perhaps none of us has mentioned yet that we need to bear in mind. But you're talking about the things that are not mentioned. I find that in social media there's nothing that's not mentioned. I mean, everything, including the issues you mentioned, are constantly popping up. But who are they mentioned by, and what is their reach? When you were asking Mahua earlier about whether she misses not being in the headlines of the newspapers, increasingly she can be in the headlines of the newspapers by saying something on social media, because media is increasingly getting its stories from social media. You no longer bother to hold a press conference and issue invitations to 30 journalists. You just issue a tweet or a post, and the media will come to you. They will report the story. That's all that is changing.
Now, what about democracy? I mean, what happens is in a thriving democracy, you have a freer media. So usually when you're looking at all these indexes, Scandinavia comes up on top. And then as you find with authoritarianism, there's suppression, and then you'll find other people finding different outlets, or some people be quiet, completely quiet. So as politicians, are you quite happy but comfortable thinking, okay, media knows its place now, we can dictate?
No. I don't think anyone, not at all. I mean, certainly the we here, when you think of politicians, again, they're not a homogeneous mass. You can't put the ruling party and opposition in the same basket. So obviously, the we here might apply to the ruling party, certainly doesn't apply to us. So no, we're not happy. But just linking your previous question and now, when you say that some things are off limits, these limits or these sort of obstacles or these walls are set up by systems that are in place. Social media is more or less unregulated. Some are more regulated than others. For Twitter, for example, I think is actually quite regulated because somebody makes a hoo-ha quick enough and somebody else files an FIR, you put a takedown notice, it happens. But for example, in a rural constituency, you'll have probably something even viler than what's on Twitter, on topics that you mentioned, and nothing is off limits on social media. So you will have WhatsApp groups. You say nobody mentioned Kashmir, fine. But there are WhatsApp groups in Bengal, in Bihar, and anywhere that there is no stopping them from spreading fake news on Kashmir and sending it around, and it's days before we even know what's happening. So there is really no, in the cyber world, there are no walls and there are no rules. So all these rules that you say only establish print to television media doesn't apply to social media, and that's the great danger of it, because on the one hand, you have habeas corpus petitions not coming up in the Jammu and Kashmir High Court for years and for almost 2 years now. But on the other hand, every other topic is being discussed freely on social media, and unfortunately, more often than not, it's a one-way street.
Then, of course, there's ownership. We know the Rupert Murdoch, he has his agenda. And now there was this panic when Elon Musk was going to be taking over Twitter, they thought, and then they'll bring Trump back. And then Trump was taken off. Any thoughts on that? I'll start with you and then others.
Clearly, who owns the press shapes what the press says. And that's particularly evident, I think, in India over the past few years, where, I'm an avid consumer of the Indian news media, print, TV, social. The bandwidth has narrowed. The number of voices which stand out against the direction of travel of the government has been reduced. It's been reduced because proprietors are nervous, scared, or they wish to be compliant. There are exceptions, and one of the things I think is rather promising in India is actually here the digital revolution has meant that established news providers have reinvented themselves. So, the BBC website, the Guardian website, the subscription Times and FT websites, they're still the repositories of what most people would see as reliable, authoritative, broadly impartial, to different degrees partisan websites. In India, what you've seen is, because for all sorts of reasons, which I don't think I'll go into, you've seen a whole range of new news and current affairs and information websites spring up, with Wire, with Scroll, rather different, but Quint as well. And I think that has been really rather encouraging. Their business model remains deeply, deeply insecure, but their reach and more, their profile and their authority is steadily growing. And I find that really quite encouraging. I read papers which do stand out against the grain, and there are one or two TV channels which stand out against the grain. But it's a difficult climate, and it's much more difficult, I think, for all sorts of reasons in India than it is here in the UK, though God knows we've got enough problems here as well.
Rita, just to compliment that, I mean, the insidious thing in some societies is that where mainstream media is owned by people who have other business interests, the government actually doesn't need to attack the mainstream media. It can simply send a signal to the owner of the media that when he writes, or his editors write something that the government disapproves of, he'll have a tax rate on his other business, which is what makes him all the money that enables him to own the media. You can be very sure that his priorities are very quickly established. And the offending editor may be sacked before he undergoes the torment of another tax raid. So these are some of the challenges that big mainstream media has, that usually the more light, sprightly digital media doesn't have. They don't have the huge capital costs, the huge infrastructure costs, and so on. And they can therefore get away with fewer means, as it were, fewer vulnerabilities to official pressure.
Yeah, in India also, we don't do conflict of interest very well. We don't do it very well in any sphere of life, and especially not in the media. For example, even in Parliament, we don't have a register of interest. So, for example, if you're a media baron in India, you can actually be part of a parliamentary standing committee on media. And in the UK, you would have to have a register of interest. If you spoke on a topic in Parliament that you were aligned with, you would have to declare that. So I think in India, the conflict of interest is a bit, so you can have one or two of the largest media houses having private equity arms and investing in companies that they're actually using opinion pieces to promote. And there's really no fine line, there are no disclaimers, and that's a very, I would say, very slippery slope that most people are not aware of. And this is one big loophole, I would say, in our governance.
I was at a presentation at the Media Freedom Index that was launched. And what people spoke, there was a speaker from Russia and a speaker from Hong Kong. And they're talking about how fragile an independent media can be. Because in Hong Kong, the media was relatively independent. And in Russia, they still had independent outlets. But at the moment Ukraine happened, state media took control. And all the independent journalists, they decamped. And they left, and they set up stations elsewhere, in Lithuania, Estonia, and so on. And in a way, all the sort of people who would have been considered dissidents left. And then the Russian state was quite happy because suddenly all the troublemakers were out of the country. And the same has happened with Hong Kong. Flourishing media, they left. And I know that there are people here who know these regions well, and hopefully they will comment in the question and answers. So people go outside. And then I gather now that dissidents from Russia are all meeting in Yerevan and set up, independent media things, but that's not making quite an impact. So just a last thought from you all that you think that I missed, that you'd like to say, any other points, and then we'll open up to the audience. So in the discussion so far, Andrew, is there something you've been burning to say and haven't had a chance to say?
No, I think I'd like to be able to respond to questions from the audience.
Yeah. Shashi, anything
Sure.
more?
No, let's do that. Let's turn to the audience.
Well, there we are. So, audience, do you want to ask any challenging
There's a hand in the back
questions?
right
A
there.
hand in the back, please. Could you say your name, maybe affiliation if you want to?
Which media organization you belong to?
Yeah, very important. And if you're a troll, and then yeah, and think of the question, and also say who you want to answer the question of the whole
Sure.
panel.
I'm Utkarsh. I run an education media company called Network Capital. I'm not a troll, but I'm actually curious if it's a crazy idea to think of, say, Facebook and Twitter and TikTok as countries, not companies. Because their market capitalization is roughly equal to the GDP of India. Apple is 2.5, India is 2.5. And I think if you consider them as countries, not companies, you can actually negotiate with them. I was wondering, it's a thought experiment. And the other, because I run an education media company, I'm actually really confused about the issue of deplatforming someone.
Issue
of deplatforming
Deplatforming.
somebody. Suppose I, as owner of Network Capital, if I decide to deplatform somebody who's behaving really badly, I'm just not sure how to go about it. Any advice?
Excellent. I think all three of you are in a position to give advice. Just start
Right.
with you, Mahua.
Yeah, the idea that big tech are countries is not new. That's something that's been around for a long time. Big tech has always been viewed as countries, and not only in terms of GDP and the way they turn it, and in terms of the control they have over people's lives. They are running like quasi-governments, and governments do deal with them as governments, and very often smaller governments get blackmailed by the power of big tech. So I don't think that's obviously something that's out there. The second thing about deplatforming someone, I'm not quite sure how you go about doing it, I'm sure, but at least the idea of deplatforming someone or getting someone, and we've been through the whole Trump debate, but it has to be within we are both on the IT committee, and for us, for a takedown notice or for deplatforming somebody, it has to be within the framework of the law. So you can't just deplatform someone for being rude or saying something that you don't like. It has to be something that he has said that is, incitement to violence, or given the current law of the land, that he is in violation of it. So I think, aside from that, it's very difficult to deplatform someone, is my understanding.
It's a bit more complicated. I mean, Moha and I both serve on the IT Committee of Parliament, and this issue has come up there. I mean, I chair that committee. And on the deplatforming question, we had, you may be surprised, an enormous amount of outrage expressed by ruling party members on the committee, who are actually a majority on the committee, after Mr. Trump was deplatformed by Twitter. Because these people asked on what basis it was done. The Twitter representative we'd summoned explained that they follow their quote-unquote community standards, which everybody who signs that Twitter agreement no one reads when you open your account, obliges you to respect. And when they said that we felt that Mr. Trump's tweets violated our community standards, the concern was tomorrow they could do that to an Indian political leader, maybe even the Indian Prime Minister. And they said, how can you do that if the person concerned has not been found guilty by an Indian court of law of a transgression? What gives you the right to take away their freedom of speech? Yeah, the Kangana Ranaut case happened around the same time or just a little later. Now, these are important questions because obviously there are those who say that we can't have an entity like Twitter or Facebook coming to India and deciding which of our citizens has the right to enjoy free speech, which is an argument you can understand them making. But equally, Twitter and Facebook say we have global standards. We can't have lower standards in one country and different standards elsewhere, so we try and maintain international standards. This issue has not been fully resolved. But while we've been away, there's been a story in the Indian media indicating that our government, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, is about to issue a new rule which would in fact subject the deplatforming decisions of these social media companies to a review by a government-appointed body, which then gives the government the right to tell Twitter and Facebook, thou shalt not deplatform Mahua Moitra for being rude to the Prime Minister, whatever. I mean, the truth is that that is going to be an interesting thing to watch, and we will have to sort this out in terms of our views on the committee. but there will be some division of opinion on this matter. On your earlier thing about treat them, negotiate with them like a government, there is a difference. A government has an embassy. They have diplomatic immunity. I have to treat them with respect as an equal. A company, a social media company, is subject to the laws of my land. And I, as a parliamentary committee, can summon those people and demand explanations, which we've done. We don't see ourselves in a relationship of equals. So there may be a country in terms of gross revenue or GDP size. They're not a country in terms of their rights and prerogatives in a foreign land.
And I absolutely agree with that. Countries, nations, even those which are not democratic, have a level of accountability. And I don't see that with the big digital corporates. So if they are as powerful as countries, then I think they need to be taken down a peg or two, or even three. We can't have corporations which are that powerful because they are powers only to themselves. Deplatforming, I was deeply uncomfortable with Twitter's decision to deplatform Trump. He was at the time the serving American president. You could argue that he was promoting disinformation, that he was telling lies. Politicians do sometimes have different views about what is true and what is not. I do think if you start to deplatform people because you find that they are beyond what you think should be the acceptable bandwidth, you then fall into a very slippery slope, which means that you actually get political censorship of social media. Censorship because of hate speech, of misogyny, racism, homophobia. I understand that. But if people are misrepresenting the truth, we had it in this country with the Brexit debate. Remember the slogan on the bus, leave the European Union and we save £300 million a week. It was both true and not true. And the established media had a great difficulty dissembling that, picking into it without giving a sense that they were demolishing it, they were being partisan. There needs to be ways in which the media can tackle disinformation without censoring things which might be seen to be misleading.
Okay, so the gentleman there, and then the next to you, and then the third. All right. So if you'd like to speak. Yes, someone. The mic is making its way to you.
Broadcasting, so you need to speak on the mic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Saket Narula. I'm an investor in deep tech venture capital in this country.
A little closer to you.
My name is Saket Narula. I'm an investor in deep tech venture capital in the UK. There was a conversation just last week at the Blavatnik School and also at King's College London in the public administration space. I'm just going to throw that idea and hopefully get comments and thoughts from all of you. It shifts gears slightly away from rulemaking and regulation and some of the topics that I think, Andrew, you said about amplification of content and thoughts out there, which I agree with in some ways that, the platforms are created to be tools and basically providing bread and sugar to make things sound and have access to people to use Twitter, etc. But particularly the question is around the role of government or public administration in creating better tools for disseminating information, facts, and maybe parts of media such as The Guardian, such as the BBC, the Financial Times, etc., that have credible journalism that are sourced, having scholarly work and references, just made more accessible to people. I mean, technology is there. They're just not using it. So just want to get your thoughts on not the rules and regulation, but the role of public administration in India, in the UK, parliamentary notes and procedures made available and people can access it easily. Are they doing enough? Thank you.
You were head of BBC News. Maybe start with you and then the other
Well,
speakers.
I left the BBC quite a while ago and I'm not speaking here on behalf of the BBC. We have a unique situation in this country where BBC content, including online, is freely available. You don't have to pay for it. It's there. The Guardian has also managed to keep almost all of its content freely available by a hugely different route, which is following the National Public Radio model in the States and getting money from well-wishers. And The Guardian, I mean, the actual printed copy of The Guardian is now the least successful of all Britain's established national daily papers. It sells just a little over 100,000 copies a day, which is a quarter of what it sold 10 or 15 years ago. But through donations, it has managed to keep its digital offering freely available. Now, not everybody can go down that route, and in terms of what the government's role is in promoting that, I am slightly wary of that, because the great strength of the internet, it's a double-edged sword, but the great strength is that it's free of government. If something is seen to be made available by government, regulated by government, controlled by government, then people are bound to believe that it is telling the government it's his master's voice. So I can't see how far you can go down that without destroying the authority of the platform you're seeking to promote.
But governments themselves can use media to issue authoritative information to the public. I remember in the very early days, the Pune Municipal Corporation gave their garbage collection times for different areas on social media. Delhi police started issuing traffic updates saying avoid such a road, there's terrible congestion. It became a very useful service that way. And then the Indian Railways, just a little over a year or two, or less than 2 years ago, well, actually just before COVID, I think it was, came up with a very interesting scheme where you can tweet emergency information to them. So imagine, I mean, there's one instance where somebody's father had a heart attack on a train. Now, in the old days, what would you do? You'd pull the emergency chain, but you're driving, your train is going through some rural area.
But this is
no
public,
doctor's going to get to
this
you.
is public service, though. It's not contested news. Contested news is altogether different.
Correct. So the fellow issues the tweet, the train continues running, reaches the next station, and doctors are waiting for his father. And this has actually happened. So these kinds of, I'm not disagreeing with you at all, Andrew. I'm just complimenting what you're saying, that governments too can use private social media to get official information out to the general public.
Yeah, I think on balance, I think India does a fairly good job, given the size of our country and in the inaccessibility of a lot of places. I actually think there are two different things. If you're talking about government setting up an alternate medium, I'm not sure that was your question. I think your question was, how is government better at using media to get to administer? And if that's the question, then I actually think that government's doing a pretty good job. And, not only, I think every police department in every city is on Twitter. The police commissioners are on Twitter. Information is very quick in terms of disseminating information, even traffic information. There are sites you can go to. So I think in terms of most schedules of the district collectors or the district magistrates, they have very updated sites, websites, which the information's put out. I mean, the press information, PIB in India. So I think as far as information's, our parliamentary stuff is put up every day. If we have to see what our business is, it's on the Lok Sabha website before anybody else gets it. So I actually think in terms of disseminating information to administer, the government does a pretty good job, local, municipal, village, and central government.
Do you agree, Shashi? This has been a very civilized discussion.
Need to invite Mr. Amit Shah next time.
The tone of the moderator.
So, is there anyone who disagrees with anything? Okay. You don't have to disagree. What's your point? Thank you. So the mic is making its way to you.
Hi, my name is Srijit. I'm not affiliated to anyone, and I'm going to ask this without being disagreeable. But I detected a sense of irony, Mr. Tharoor and Madam Moitra, in what you spoke about the asymmetry of using social media in lots of international contexts, like all the color revolutions that you mentioned. But when it comes to India, I sense, not just in this session, but very often, a sense of pervasive resignation that the ruling party or powers that be seem to have overwhelmed the messaging of anybody else that doesn't seem to agree with them. How is it that you seem to have ceded ground or almost conceded the battle in what is the most quintessentially asymmetric platform possible? Is it a communication issue, or is it a content issue, or is it something else?
It's simply a question of resources. The BJP, in all fairness, at a time when, for example, my own party disapproved madly of what I was doing on social media and made it clear they did, the BJP leapt onto this. The Prime Minister opened his account the same year as I did. The present Prime Minister. At that time, he was Chief Minister of Gujarat. He was an opposition figure. They saw the potential. In fact, it's been explained by one of their social media heads publicly that they felt they weren't getting a fair hearing for their point of view in the mainstream media. That was their point of view at that time when they were in opposition. And therefore, they decided social media was going to be their preferred vehicle. And they expended the resources to organize an enormous, enormous effort. All these cells we're talking about, their books now are revealing all of this. 30,000 people hired, paid a full salary. Our parties couldn't afford to do that. Paid a full-time salary. They work literally 8 hours a day, each of them running thousands of groups, WhatsApp groups, fake group, Twitter accounts, bot accounts, all of this stuff. And then there's actually a ruling party person saying, this will be the line on such and such issue. And then, they manufacture material that's given to these people to then put out. So poor Rahul Gandhi pauses for too long in answering a question in Cambridge has happened a little while. That video is quickly clipped out of a 1 hour interview. It's whatever, 1 minute long or 50 seconds long, and then given to these thousands of people to each multiply and send out to 256 accounts, multiply by 100 and of the tweets and Facebook and so on. And the next thing you know, the entire nation has seen this and thinks that the entire interview was him being unable to answer questions, where he's actually spoken eloquently for an hour, but it's this 1 minute that's all over the place. Now, we don't have the resources to do this. We don't have the people. We can't afford to pay them if we did, and so on and so forth. So when you ask, why aren't you doing to the BJP what they did to you when you were in power, the truth is that first mover advantage and now lots of money.
Yes, I agree with that. And also, what's happened now is they're doing it very well, not to take away from it. I mean, you've got to give it to them. They have the way we have a Mahila Congress or a Mahila Trinamool Congress or a student wing or a Mahila wing, they've actually got an IT wing. And they have, for example, they have an IT in charge of Bengal. And under that, they have an IT in charge of every district. And in terms of formulating strategy, that person sits on the table and say, how do we execute this? This is what we need to do. And this is a very, very well-oiled machine. And we've seen it during campaigns, but even out of campaigns. If they decide this is an issue and we want to run with it, they will, within 24 hours, create the mahol, so to speak. So, for example, you want to establish Rahul Gandhi is a pappu. That's it. So everybody, Kanyakumari to Kashmir, sit down and these are the stories you need to drip, 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 drip to establish. You want to establish Mahua and Shashi are very friendly, get a photo of them sitting here, maybe talking to each other like this, clip that, put a nasty heading. It'll be on Twitter all over the place tomorrow saying, India is burning, Shashi Tharoor is frolicking with Mahua, Moitra in London. And this will happen. This will happen tomorrow. This will happen tomorrow. I mean, unfortunately,
already taking
notes. So I thought I'd just make their job a little easier, right? So this is what I mean.
Just use that clip, cleverly edited, of what Mahua was saying, and we're there. We've got the story.
It goes back to the old thing. Yes, they have the resources. Yes, they have the will. But I've come to a point where even if I had the resources, I don't know if I want to fight that fight. I don't know if that's going to be good for the nation or good for the polity to go down that way. Really? I mean, just to make up stories and try and, make them out to be true, I'm not sure that can last very long. I may be wrong, but...
So, Andrew, the media's very naughty.
Can I just mention the K word here, the one that Rita said was difficult to mention. When you talk about asymmetry in the digital context, you've got to think about what's been happening in Kashmir, where if the authorities there, the military or the army or the governor, doesn't like what's circulating in digital landscapes and social media, they just pull the plug. And that has happened time and time again, particularly since the abrogation of 370. I understand the security climate there and all the difficulties, but silly. We need to remember that asymmetry has really deeply eroded the already very poor quality of life of people in the Kashmir Valley.
We've got 2 minutes left. What I'd like to close with, and maybe get your comments on that, is one extreme example of the danger to journalists or what can happen to freedom of speech is Iran. Now, the BBC has been running special programs and issues to talk about how Persians or Iranians working for the BBC, their relatives are being threatened by Iran for working with the BBC. So journalists here are being told, we know where your daughter goes to school. She could have a car accident. They've been told that your father is very ill in hospital, but they won't see him. We could stop them being seen. They've not been able to talk to their dying parents for the last time. The relatives of BBC journalists working in Iran are losing jobs. So this is the worst case scenario. So I really think that one needs to be vigilant all the time, because a free media, independent media is very, very fragile. So just very quickly, just a quick last-minute message from you all to the audience before everyone breaks up. Mahua, anything for the future?
One quick thing. I think by the very nature of our people like us, I would say, or our voters are essentially people who believe largely in liberal democracy. Now, unfortunately, people like that, by the very nature of who they are not that fanatic about anything. And unfortunately, the people who vote for the right wing are only too glad, even without being paid for it, to become soldiers in that army. So my sister and I had gone last week to the Stasi Museum in Berlin, and when the Berlin Wall came down, the East Germans actually had 170,000 people enrolled as non-paying spies who were just spying on their neighbors, simply because they believed in the cause. Now, it is far easier when you're a rabid right-winger to be enlisted as a social media, even volunteer to take that message. Unfortunately, I can't get my sister or my mother, or Shashi can't get his sister or his mother to sort of respond with the same vengeance, as they simply don't feel the same way. So because of this difference in the value system, I think it is more important than ever before to sort of stand up for a free media, because to realize that if we use normal people to fight the fight, there's always going to be more of them on rabid social media than there is going to be us.
Yeah, I would still say, perhaps as a caveat for the end of our discussion, that media is still ultimately, social media is still ultimately an instrument. It's a tool in the hands of governments, parties, and so on, but it's not the story itself. In my view, for example, you mentioned Iran. Do you remember the time when there was that election that was rigged for Ahmadinejad? Mm-hmm. And there was a huge uproar on social media. Iranians had the courage to come out. They even tried to do it at Tahrir Square and call people out the streets to protest. It went on for weeks. But in the end, the government outlasted them, and Ahmadinejad served his full term, which he had won from this rigged election. In other words, the media alone cannot deliver for you what a system doesn't allow you to deliver. It is one instrument, and I think we shouldn't perhaps exaggerate its impact. All we've said is true, but it's not the whole story. Governments are still more powerful.
We've got used to expecting access to trusted news media at no cost or next to no cost. The business model has gone. The advertising income has gone. If you want to access, subscribe. The business model depends on you using your spending power to put some of your money in the pockets of people who are providing the news content that you trust.
Well, thank you. I've learned a lot, and these amazing, wonderful panelists, and Shashi's going to be doing more exciting things today. I'm looking forward to your comedy stand-up act. So thank you for being such an engaged audience with such interesting questions. So all the best to all of you, and thank you to the speakers.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shashi.
Whatever you did, if it wasn't good enough, you needed to try and do better and keep at it.
Actually, village life produces the philosophical ideas that are germane to democratic thought and practice.
I mean, just losing 4 of your bandmates, soulmates is bad enough. But the worst thing is, out of those 4 families, 2 of the families blamed me.
But the progress from 1991 to 2017, I think, only took India to a better place.
It was really through the through the transition into politics that I had the good luck of becoming a writer.